Fight breakdown, the Chandala on the roads. Fight breakdown, the Chandala on the road in approximately the year 815 of the Common Era. In the holy city of Varanasi on the bank of the Ganges, Adi Shankaracharya was walking in the morning to bathe in the river when he encountered, on a narrow path, a man of the lowest caste in the orthodox Brahminical hierarchy, a Chandala, and was given, in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, the most important attack of his life. The encounter is preserved in the traditional accounts in stylized form. Different versions of the story emphasize different features. We will treat the version most consistent with the historical sources and most directly relevant to the dialectical lesson, while noting where the tradition itself disagrees about specifics. It is, by some distance, the most ethically significant. The encounter at Govinda's cave, Fight Breakdown 1, was a credentialing moment for an entering disciple. The Mahishi debate, Fight Breakdown 2, was a technical exhibition of the offensive arsenal. The encounter on the road in Varanasi is something else. It is the moment a master craftsman is taught, by a man the social structure had not credited as a teacher, what his own teaching actually requires of his behavior. The lesson, once received, produced verses that survived their occasion by 12 centuries. We will study how the lesson was delivered, how it was received, and what the structure of the reception teaches about the highest form of the counterattack we examined. The setting Varanasi, also called Kashi, is on the western bank of the Ganges in what is now the state of Uttar Pradesh. The city is, by tradition, among the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. By Shankara's time, it had been a major center of Sanskrit learning for over a millennium. The riverbank ghats, the stepped stone platforms descending into the water, were the ritual heart of the city. Bathing in the Ganges at the ghats was, and is, one of the central observances of orthodox Hindu life. The streets of Varanasi in the early 9th century were narrow. The lanes between buildings were often barely wide enough for two people to pass without one stepping aside. The lanes leading down to the ghats, where most of the city's population converged at dawn for ritual bathing, were among the busiest. The orthodox social rules governing public space included strict conventions about who stepped aside for whom, by caste, by gender, by ritual status. A sannyasi, a renunciate, was, in the orthodox hierarchy, of high spiritual rank, and conventionally a Chandala would step aside on encountering a sannyasi. The conventions were not legal rules, they were social practices observed by most of the population, with real costs for those who violated them. Shankara, by the period of the encounter, was a recognized figure in Varanasi. He had been teaching there for some time. He was identifiable on the street, the renunciate's robes, the dunda, the wooden staff carried by certain orders of sannyasi, the company of disciples. Encounter on the road was not a private moment. It occurred on a public path, in front of disciples, possibly in front of other passers-by. The time of day, by the most common version of the story, was early morning. Shankara was walking from the place he had spent the night to the river, intending to bathe before the day's teaching. The light would have been thin. The streets would have been busy with others on similar errands. The city was awake. The opponent, the Chandala of the traditional accounts, is described with considerable care. He was not depicted as random or anonymous. He was carrying meat. The traditional accounts specify that he was on his way to or from work that involved the handling of dead animals, an occupation that placed him, in the orthodox hierarchy, among the most ritually polluting professions. He was accompanied by 4 dogs. The 4 dogs are textually specific. The traditional commentary on the encounter notes that, in some readings, the 4 dogs are allegorical. They represent the 4 Vedas. Some commentators read the entire encounter as an allegorical visitation of Shiva himself in the form of a Chandala, with the 4 Vedas walking at his side, testing Shankara's commitment to the doctrine he had been teaching. Other commentators read the encounter as a historical event involving a literal Chandala with literal dogs, with the symbolic resonance arising from later interpretation. The reader is invited to choose the reading that seems most plausible. What is unambiguous on either reading is that the Chandala's status in the social structure of the time was such that the conventional behavior expected of him on encountering a sannyasi was to step aside, lower his eyes, and wait for the sannyasi to pass. Whatever else the Chandala was, he was a man whose place in the social structure had been fully prescribed. He was not expected to deliver philosophical attacks. He delivered one. The pre-fight there is, in the traditional accounts, no pre-fight in the sense of preparation by either party. Shankara was on a routine walk. The Chandala was on a routine errand. The encounter was not staged. Both parties came to it without rehearsal. But the pre-fight, in the deeper sense, had been Shankara's entire teaching career to that point. For a decade, perhaps 2 decades, Shankara had been writing and teaching the doctrine that the underlying reality of all beings is Brahman, that the Atman in every individual is identical with the Atman in every other, that distinctions of body, social rank, ritual status, and the various structures organizing daily life are vyavaharika, provisionally real for practical purposes, but not ultimately real. The doctrine was the center of his teaching. The Brahma Sutra Bhashya, the Upanishadic commentaries, the Vivekachudamani, all of his major work was, in one form or another, the explication of this doctrine. The doctrine had a behavioral implication. If the Atman in all beings is the same, then social hierarchies based on bodily identity are at the level of ultimate reality without metaphysical foundation. The conventions could be observed in the Vyavaharika sphere as features of social practice. They could not be defended in the Paramartha sphere as expressions of underlying reality. The doctrine and the conventions stood in tension. The tension was managed, in the technical literature, by the distinction between the 2 levels of reality. The tension had not, by the time of the encounter, been tested in Shankara's own daily behavior by anyone capable of seeing the test. The orthodox students he taught were committed to the conventions. They did not press him on the implications of the doctrine for behavior. The opposing scholars he debated had their own reasons for not pressing on this point. Most of them were also operating within the orthodox conventions, and the metaphysics versus behavior question was not the central technical issue between schools. The Chandala on the road was the first opponent Shankara had ever faced who was structurally positioned to deliver the precise attack the doctrine made available. He had, by his social location, the standing to receive the conventional gesture and to ask whether it could be reconciled with the doctrine. The Chandala did not, on the surface, look like a participant in a philosophical debate. He was a man with dogs and meat. The depth of his question was visible only after it had been asked. The opening Shankara was walking. His disciples were walking with him. The path narrowed. The Chandala, with his dogs, came toward them from the opposite direction. By the conventions of the time, the Chandala should have stepped aside. He did not. Shankara, in the moment, did what almost any sannyasi of his period and milieu would have done. He gestured. He called out. The traditional accounts give the words variously, but the general shape is consistent. Make way, step aside, move. The gesture was reflexive. It came from the social training of the body, the years of being treated by social convention as someone for whom others stepped aside, rather than from any deliberate choice. The Chandala stopped on the path. He looked at Shankara. He asked the question. The question, in the traditional Sanskrit, is preserved in the verses Shankara composed after the encounter, and it is one of the most precisely targeted attacks in the recorded history of Indian dialectic. Anamayad anamayam asava chaitanyam eva chaitanyat Yatavara Jurakatam Vankasi, Kim Bruhai Gaka Gaka Iti. In approximate English, best of renunciates, when you say go go, are you asking the body of food to move out of the way of the body of food? Or are you asking consciousness to move out of the way of consciousness? Tell me which. The question uses Shankara's own technical vocabulary. The Annamaya, the food body, the gross physical layer of being in the Upanishadic anatomy, is a term from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which Shankara himself had commented on. Chaitanya, consciousness, is the term Shankara used in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya and elsewhere for the Atman. The question presents Shankara with a precise dichotomy. If Shankara says, I am asking the food body to move out of the way of the food body, the answer is technically incoherent on his own terms. The food bodies of two beings are not in any deeper sense in each other's way. They are configurations of food, and configurations of food do not have priority over other configurations of food. To ask one food body to move for another is to act as if one configuration had a higher claim on the path than another, which the doctrine does not support. If Shankara says, I am asking consciousness to move out of the way of consciousness, the answer is even worse. Consciousness, on Shankara's own teaching, is one. There is one Chaitanya present in both the sannyasi and the Chandala. The Chaitanya is identical in both. Consciousness cannot be in its own way, because there are not two consciousnesses to be in tension. To ask consciousness to move out of the way of consciousness is to deny the unity Shankara has been teaching. The question, in either form, exposes a contradiction between Shankara's behavior and his doctrine. The behavior was reflex. The doctrine was the center of his teaching. The reflex had not been tested against the doctrine until that morning. The decisive moment, Shankara had several options. He could have answered the question on its terms. He could have explained that he had been asking neither the food body nor consciousness to move. He had been observing a social convention that operated at the Vyavaharika level, which did not commit him to any Paramartha claim about the relative priority of bodies or consciousnesses. The technical defense was available. The two-level metaphysics was already in his commentaries. It could have been deployed to explain why the conventional gesture did not contradict the underlying doctrine. The technical defense would have worked, in a narrow sense. It would not have changed what the Chandala's question had revealed about Shankara's behavior, that the reflex of caste superiority operated in his body without consultation with the metaphysics he had been teaching. The defense would have justified the reflex. It would not have eliminated the gap between the reflex and the doctrine. Shankara chose a different move. He fell to the ground in Sashtanga Pranama, the eight-limbed prostration in which the entire body, prone, contacts the earth. He fell at the Chandala's feet. He did not speak immediately. The prostration was, by the conventions of the time, an act of profound submission. It was the gesture a junior gave to a senior, a disciple to a guru, a worshipper to a deity. From a sannyasi to a Chandala, in front of disciples, in public, on the road to the river, it was a gesture so completely outside the social conventions that it would have been remembered by everyone who saw it. The disciples, who had been walking with Shankara, would have stopped. The other passers-by, if there were any, would have stopped. The Chandala himself would have been startled. Shankara, having prostrated, then composed, on the spot, in the meter and idiom of his other writings, 5 verses. The 5 verses are known in the tradition as the Manisha Panchakam, the 5 determinations of conviction. Each verse ends with a refrain, Esha eva Manisha Mama. This alone is my firm conviction, that turns each verse into a public commitment. The verses in approximate English. The one who has determined, by careful inquiry, that the entire world of experience and the experiencer are nothing but the one Atman, whether such a one be of the lowest caste or a Brahmin, that one is my guru. This alone is my firm conviction. The unborn, the unchanging, the deathless Atman that I am, and the very ascertainment of this fact, is the means of liberation. The body's distinctions do not enter into this knowing. This alone is my firm conviction. By the lamp of the realized Atman, the wise one knows their own nature. The body's caste does not bind them, even if such a one be a Chandala, that one is the one I bow to. This alone is my firm conviction. The eternal, blissful Atman, witness of intellect, having well known that the one of steady wisdom is the one I revere. The body of the wise is not what I bow to, the wisdom is. This alone is my firm conviction. The one whose attention is fixed on the eternal Brahman, even if such a one be of the lowest birth, to that one I bow, in body, in mind, in speech. This alone is my firm conviction. Each verse repeats, in different formulations, the same proposition, that the realized Atman is the only basis on which spiritual rank can be assigned, and that the social categories of caste are irrelevant to that ranking. Each verse, by its refrain, commits Shankara publicly to the position. The verses are not a private reflection, they are a public statement of doctrine, delivered in front of disciples, in response to an attack that had exposed the gap between Shankara's reflex and his teaching. The decisive feature of the move is that Shankara accepted the Chandala's question as an attack that was correct on its merits. The attack had identified a real contradiction between behavior and doctrine. Shankara, instead of defending the behavior, treated the Chandala as someone who had just delivered a teaching of considerable depth. The verses are the formal acknowledgement of that teaching, in the form of Shankara's own technical idiom, with public commitment. This is the counterattack at its highest. The opponent's attack has been converted into the catalyst for the most important doctrinal commitment of Shankara's career on this question. The attack's energy has not been deflected, it has been received. The reception is the move. The aftermath, the verses entered the Advaita Vedanta tradition immediately. They were preserved in the corpus attributed to Shankara, and they have been recited and commented on continuously since the 9th century. The 5 short verses are, by some measures, the most cited single composition in Shankara's career. They appear in the daily liturgy of several Advaita lineages. They are quoted in commentarial works of the 11th, 14th, 16th, and 20th centuries. The verses also functioned, in the centuries following Shankara, as the doctrinal anchor for movements within the Advaita tradition that questioned the orthodox caste system. The Advaita doctrine, at the metaphysical level, did not by itself entail any particular position on caste. The Vyavaharika Paramartha distinction allowed the conventions to be observed, even when the metaphysics did not require them. The Manisha Panchakam tightened the implication. By committing publicly to that one is my guru, even if a Chandala, Shankara had foreclosed the option of treating the metaphysics as separate from the social behavior. Subsequent reformers within the tradition, including, by some accounts, the modern figures who challenged orthodox caste practice in the 19th and 20th centuries, drew on the verses as authoritative. The episode is, in this sense, the largest counterattack Shankara ever performed. The opponent's attack, directed at a single moment of reflexive behavior on a narrow road in Varanasi, produced verses that reformed, over 12 centuries, the social implications of an entire metaphysical system. What is striking, on reflection, is that the reform was not the result of Shankara having defended himself well. The reform was the result of his having lost the small encounter, having accepted that the Chandala had been right on the merits, and having converted the loss into a public commitment that bound him and his tradition into different behavior. The lost moment produced the 1 century. This is the high form of the move we have been studying. The defense that wins is sometimes the defense that surrenders. The Chandala's attack was conceded. The concession was the platform from which Shankara's doctrine completed itself. The modern parallel, Birmingham, April 1963, the closest modern parallel to the encounter at Varanasi, in structure if not in detail, is the document Martin Luther King wrote in the Birmingham City Jail in April of 1963. King had been arrested for participating in unauthorized protests against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. While he was in jail, 8 white clergymen, Christians and Jewish, published an open letter in a Birmingham newspaper. The letter was not from King's enemies. The clergymen were, on their public records, sympathetic to civil rights. They were, by some standards, allies. The letter, however, criticized King's tactics. It urged that the protests be discontinued. It suggested that change should come through the courts rather than through public demonstrations. It noted that the protests were, in the clergymen's view, unwise and untimely. King received the letter in jail. He had several options. He could have ignored it. The letter was an attack, however moderately phrased. King had no obligation to respond. He could have responded briefly, defending the tactics. He could have responded angrily, noting that the clergymen had failed to support the movement at the moments when support would have mattered most. He did none of these. Instead, he wrote, on the margins of newspapers and on scraps of paper smuggled into and out of the jail, a sustained reply that would, over the following decades, become one of the most cited documents in 20th century moral philosophy. The letter from Birmingham jail is approximately 7,000 words. It is not, despite its length, a defensive document. It is a teaching. King uses the clergyman's letter as the occasion for his most thorough public articulation of the moral structure of nonviolent resistance. He answers each of the clergymen's criticisms in turn, but the answers are the lesser part of the letter. The greater part is the case the letter exists to make, a case about just and unjust laws, about the moral standing of those who break unjust laws openly and accept the consequences, about the relation between the church and the movement, about the proper response to injustice in a society that has not yet found the will to face it. The letter is structurally what Shankara did at Varanasi. The attack from sympathetic critics on a real point was received rather than refuted. The reception was used as the platform for the most important public statement King had yet made on the philosophy of his movement. The clergyman's letter became, in its consequences, the catalyst for a document that survived its occasion by decades and is now read in every American university where civil rights history is taught. The structural parallel is precise. Both Shankara and King faced attacks from positions of doctrinal seriousness. Both attacks identified, in their targets' conduct, gaps that required addressing. Both targets chose to receive the attack as a teaching rather than to defend the conduct. Both produced documents, 5 verses for Shankara, 7,000 words for King, that committed them and their movements to the position the attack had made unavoidable. The lesson, in both cases, is the same. Some attacks should not be defended against. Some attacks should be accepted at the level of substance and used as the occasion for the most important statement the defender has yet been required to make. The discrimination, which attacks are of this kind and which call for the cascade and the counter, is part of the ethical practice of dialectic that we will treat. For our purposes here, the lesson is structural. The counterattack at the highest form does not refute, it receives. The reception, when the attack has identified something true, is the move that converts the encounter into the most important teaching available.